Now, just to introduce our speaker today, we have Dave, who's going to present the topic to us. He's got quite a good deep background in research. He's worked as a developer, a pen tester in that realm for about 10 years. He's a security architect. He's been for about 12, and he's currently a security architect at Electronic Arts. He considers himself to be an AppSec person. Had a brief chat with Dave the week before, and if you're interested in things like games or Lego, games, Dave is definitely a good person to include. We had a good catch up last time. He is quite knowledgeable on the topic of threat modeling, as you will hear. And from his experiences, I feel that you can draw quite a bit as well. So without further ado, what I'm going to do is I'm going to hand over the stage to Dave, and he's going to take us through today's topic of high assurance threat models.
Thanks very much, Robin. Just let me share my screen. Hopefully everyone can see that, and that is largely what Robin just introduced me. So yes, a bit of a research and developer and pen testing background. Mostly do security architecture these days, which obviously means different things to different people. I largely think about it as helping companies with software manage that risk when they create and operate that software. And yeah, mostly an AppSec person. That's been most of my background. And of the mandatory disclaimer, opinions here are my own and not necessarily those of my employer. So what will I be talking about today? Well, this is basically the contents, really. So context I'll start out with. You and I almost certainly have some different ideas about what threat modeling is. So we don't all have the same problem to solve. So I want to set some context about what I'm talking about when I talk about threat modeling. There's an origin here, right? So there's a story about how I came to this thing I've called high assurance threat modeling. And I think that will also add context that will be beneficial. There's a method, so they'll just cover the basic approach that I'm talking about. I want to talk about value. So this is both things to avoid and some things to make sure you do to get the most value out of the ideas I'll be talking about. And I'll also discuss the actual value that's delivered for me. And then finally, some takeaways. This is my summary of the main things that I want you to remember. So first up is context, right? Because it can be confusing. We're not always talking about the same things when we talk about things. So high assurance threat modeling. What do I mean when I talk about this, or just threat modeling in general? So, am I talking about the threat modeling program that covers all the threat models you create when you're operating a threat modeling program? Or am I talking specifically about the process of creating an individual threat model? I'm talking specifically about the process of creating an individual threat model. That's the assurance I'm focusing on. I'm not focusing on the assurance of the whole threat modeling program. What sorts of threat modeling? Like I said, I'm mostly an AppSec person, so all the sorts of things that AppSec people look at, a bit of infrastructure as well, some client-side stuff, but mostly your normal sort of AppSec stuff. And for me, a threat model is really a structured document. It's not really a brainstorming session or a stand-up chat. It's really like something that the output would be some sort of document. And assurance of what? Well, assurance of scope. That's really what I'm going to focus on. I want to be able to have confidence I've identified everything that is relevant to the system that I'm threat modeling. Not really looking at assurance of threats today, although I don't think you could probably have assurance of threats without some sort of assurance of scope, but that could be a whole nother talk. And what makes it high? Well, I'm just really saying that this is something that you focus on, something you actually do. You don't sort of hope you get this coverage by accident or anything like that. It's an actual activity that you look at. So spoiler alert for this is really, I'm going to be talking about how consistency can be used to achieve high assurance. So this means discussing what we can do in our threat modeling process to ensure consistency, or to think of it another way, to be able to detect inconsistency. It's a really basic example just to sort of give you a flavor. Imagine you're capturing some information and it's stored in a database. Now, consistency means that that database, that thing that you're talking about, this component that's part of your system, your threat modeling, is captured as part of the scope. And it should be because by virtue of the assets that are being stored there. So the idea itself is quite straightforward, right? We're only talking about referencing things that you talk about. And to some extent, you'd be forgiven for reacting like, hey, Dave, what am I going to spend the next 30 minutes listening to? Because really, like, consistency seems like an obviously good thing. What's going on? Just bear with me for a minute and I'll try and explain what I'm thinking here. So whilst I think it is obvious that consistency is one of those obviously good things that we could include in our threat modeling process, you probably sort of think of these other things as things we could include as well, but it's unlikely that you include them all. And I mean, that's fine, right? Like including too much can be a bad thing, especially because we all have limited resources for that whole threat modeling activity that we do. So I'm sort of saying, hey, this comes down to value a lot in terms of what you should and shouldn't include in your threat modeling process. So when I talk about high assurance and actively trying to make sure we haven't missed anything from the scope of a threat model, not really presenting it as a particularly clever idea. I'm presenting it as an idea that I think has a lot of value. And it's that value that I want to talk about today. And I want to talk both about why I think this has value, but also share my experience on the methods of delivering that value. Now, first, to really understand the value, we need some more context about why this approach ended up having value for me in the situation I was in, which was with a company producing software as a medical device. This is going to start out with where in my threat modeling journey I was when I started at the company, what direction I decided to take, what company specific factors ultimately influenced my approach. So I started out this company as a healthcare startup. I joined as a security architect. I was the first sort of dedicated AppSec person. They kind of had an SSDLC and it kind of talked about threat modeling, but they weren't really doing much. But at least they wanted to do threat modeling, and I certainly wanted to do it as well. So a quick sidebar on this, right? Now, when I started this job, it wasn't the first time I'd ever done threat modeling. I'd already been doing it for many years, and like many people, my threat modeling journey began with Stride and the Microsoft threat modeling tool. Like others, after a while, that Microsoft tool really became more of a burden than felt necessary for creating threat models. Sort of the explosion of threats and knowledge required to use it made me look for alternatives. I certainly spent some time looking at other options out there, but none really seemed to offer a process that suited my ideas about what should be involved. So perhaps naively, I went about creating my own approach. Now, I mentioned SABSA there. That's the Sherwood Applied Business Security Architecture. If you are a security architect, I recommend checking it out. It's at least worth knowing about. Anyway, coming into this healthcare job, I had the basics of the threat modeling approach I wanted to use, and hopefully wanted to mature it as well. So a big focus for me, and the approach I wanted to use, was to make it as developer-friendly as possible. For me, that meant using familiar tools. So Confluence was used internally, so I wanted to use that. Only asking the people populating the threat model, the devs in my case, only to populate data that they didn't need to be a security expert to answer. And I tried to keep the information needed at a high level, as I really only wanted to detect design issues, or at least mostly design issues. So I started with a single team that I knew the people were more security focused. I sort of held their hand through the process, being sure to understand their pain points. After that, I worked with other teams and tried to give them a head start by sharing other threat models. I also really found that sharing threat models adds legitimacy to a new threat modeling activity, really makes it clear to teams they aren't the only teams doing this. It certainly didn't all go my way, right? I found it quite hard as a security person to not ask for like all the information. No one wants to miss threats after all. But that was part of the challenge. Asking for too much information is a burden. So the question is, what could I get rid of without meaningfully affecting the threats that I would generate? So for instance, I was asking about business goals, sort of meant to help contextualize threats to the assets to better convey business risk and the risk evaluated. It's one of those like obviously good ideas that I talked about, but actually it ended up just being a big burden for the devs. And I actually could remove it without limiting what threats I would find. Now, the other thing I did was to take the idea of removing the burden on devs too far. I reasoned that since all the microservices, which was mainly what the company was producing or building, they shared the same centralized authentication approach. So I was like, well, I don't actually need to ask about authentication in my template. It's going to be the same for all of them. Now, that sounds insane when I talk about it now, But it was an optimization gone wrong, because anything else that tried to use a template that wasn't a microservice, they couldn't easily express how authentication worked. In the end, the sensible solution was to ask about authentication, but pre-populate the template with the authentication information from microservices, which could be changed if needed. So my threat modeling had begun, but this was really when the worlds of software as a medical device and threat modeling collided. So if you're not sure what a medical device is, it really can be anything. It can be your pacemaker if you've got a heart condition. If you wear glasses on your face, spectacles, those are a medical device. And certainly examples of software as a medical device would include, video conferencing software with a doctor, right? And if you have a medical device, it needs to be certified. One way this is often done is through a quality management system, which you can really think of as a document management system. And that'll largely include a control of documents. This will be the policies, a bunch of documents that say, what you will do as a company and how you will operate. And then a bunch of records, right? This is evidence of what you actually do. So specifically, you're audited against ISO 13485. Now, in terms of information security or risk, that doesn't really say a lot, but it generally points to ISO 14971 on risk management to medical devices. So 14971, that doesn't particularly mandate anything, right? It just has a bunch of information in there, but it does, we decided that threat modeling would significantly contribute towards complying with it. So it was going to be something that was going to be a focus for the company. So this was sort of a recipe for success for me. We had a policy that said, hey, we should do threat modeling. We were going to be audited against what the policy said. Literally, auditors were going to come in and make sure we were doing threat modeling. We would need to provide evidence during the audit. And so that's sort of all this means that the dev teams had to do threat models for the software to be certified as a medical device. And that's it, right? I feel like I win threat modeling at this stage because, it can often be such a challenge to get people to do it. But when your company is needs to be certified and threat modeling is part of that, that's a great situation to be in. Then you remember, hold on, all of my threat models are going to be audited. Oh no, that's putting pressure that perhaps some of us aren't used to. So basically it was, well, I better find a way to give myself some assurance they will pass this audit. So it's certainly, anyway, that's a quick overview, right, of the origin story that leads us to this high assurance threat modeling. I was developing an approach to threat modeling that used documents to capture threat models. And the company I was working for needed to use these threat modeling documents as part of their certification process for the software as a medical device they were creating. So now we can get into some of the specifics behind the approach I used. So come clean a little bit, right? I would love to say that I designed all of this assurance into the processes that we used, but I really more discovered it as I went along. But I'm probably just going to talk about it as if I designed it into the process, just to make it easier. And the discovery again was really more about the value than the actual method, which you'll see is not particularly complicated. But first, it's worth sort of saying that I've talked about consistency as a thing that delivers high assurance to your threat model. But what I haven't discussed is what problem consistency actually solves. Well, the problem is mistakes, right? Because as I said in the beginning, I want assurance nothing is missing from my scope, which means I want assurance that there have been no mistakes in scoping. So you have the situation, right? You've got your threat modeling process, and your devs are following this process to create threat models. But when a threat model contains mistakes, how would your devs know? How would you know? When would a mistake be spotted? We can understand this problem a bit better by thinking about building a Lego set, right? So I build these with my eldest kid, and these days they always include a few extra pieces of Lego. But that sort of begs the question, right? If you go through the process, you go through 100 steps, build your Lego, your lovely piece of Lego, and there will be pieces left over. Now, is one of the pieces left over an extra piece that got sent with a pack? Or is it a piece that I missed when I was building the Lego set? How could I tell? I mean, I think practically speaking, I can't. So that's an example of a very linear process, right? That usually has really no way to detect mistakes in a lot of situations. So my point being, if your threat modeling process is also a very linear process with no or few ways to detect mistakes, and this whole talk wants to raise this as an issue, right? Especially if you want more assurance in your threat models. Because the reality is people will make mistakes. And the very specific mistake that I'm talking about is failing to include scope of the relevant parts of the system. Now, it could be a whole different talk on the different types of mistake that are possible during this process, right? So these sort of scoping mistakes, people forget password storage locations, maybe communication methods for sending, access control keys, caching mechanisms. All these things can be left out accidentally. But all these reasons for these mistakes, right? Either accidentally, or maybe they didn't think it was relevant. Maybe they knew it would complicate the process. Maybe they thought it had security issues and didn't want you threat modeling it. But like, it's important though, right? Because making mistakes with the scope means important parts of your system could be missed. And you can't find threats in parts of a system that you don't know about. So what are our options, right? Option A, let's design a process where people cannot make mistakes. If you figure out how to do this, please tell me how. I have no idea. On the other hand, option B is, hey, let's design a process where mistakes can at least be detected. Now, there probably certainly are other options for solving this problem, but I'm just going to focus on the detection approach. And, using detection like this is pretty common, right? I was able to think of several other systems and use cases out there where detection is a common approach to solving the problem, right? And there are some examples here that can detect inconsistencies, let's say. Now, some of these detect mistakes really quickly, others will detect them more slowly, and others sort of only statistically, and in sort of random sampling type. So how are we going to detect when people make mistakes in their threat model? Well, I'm going to say that we're going to capture information in multiple places and check that the information is consistent. Now, you'll recall my threat models are structured documents, right? And these documents contain tables. Having separate tables to gather information was both an unexpected burden and an unexpected benefit. This was my discovery, not really my design. And you see, this isn't rocket science, right? This is choosing a very simple possible method to achieve this. So here, quite simply, I have two tables, right? And using the same example as before, I have some assets, first name, last name. I also put in the asset table where those are stored. Oh, they're stored in a database. Well, that database better be listed in my components table that lists everything, right? If it wasn't listed in the components table, that would be an inconsistent. I'm referencing a storage location that I haven't called out as something that's part of my threat model. So it's a very basic example just to sort of highlight how it might work, or how it does work. But to be more specific, right, in my approach, there are three tables that are the core tables I use to capture data. And a quick note on using Confluence. Like I said at the time, that worked well for the company. But I've used Google Docs for the same thing. The document format doesn't matter. So these three tables are your minimum, and you probably capture all of this information in your own approach to threat modeling. Maybe you don't use tables though. But for my threat models, I quite often want them to be more self-contained. So I capture other relevant things as well, which can also be used to drive consistency. Let's see if I can explain what I mean by that. So let's start out with these basic tables that I have: a component table, different names of things there, an assets table, and a threats and controls table. So I actually split my assets into two things, into functional assets and technical assets. And when I referenced SABSA before, this sort of was, it talks about structuring information like this, inspired me to do this. And functional assets for me are the business assets, the things of business value, the things you really want to protect from attackers, the thing attackers are trying to get their hands on. Whereas technical assets sort of are important, but they're not the end goal. The example I quite often use is a technical asset might be something like an encryption key. Now, if someone is an attacker and they steal an encryption key, they don't sort of go home and be like, "Oh, job done." They would also probably want to use that encryption key to decrypt something, and whatever it is they decrypt, well, that's probably the functional asset that they were after. Anyway, the other thing I capture in my threat models is like a system diagram, and you can see and normally it's an existing one. I normally try not to ask for new diagrams for people. And you see this red arrow, right? Because the system diagram will be, full of boxes. Those boxes should have, component names in them, and those component names should be listed in my component table. So the red arrow means there should be a relationship between contents of the system diagram and the components table. but I also capture a description of the system being threat modeled and some use cases for it, some document references. Well, that'll probably talk about different components as well. Very likely talk about functional assets for me as well. The functional assets themselves, well, those will talk about storage locations. That's probably a component. Technical assets, they'll talk about storage locations. That'll be a component. They'll talk about functional assets that they help protect. I'd capture an operational security table. This isn't always necessary, but some teams have control, like access control to their systems. They have to hand out and decide who have access to hand out keys and things like that, or credentials. So when that is the case, these will talk about components. Technical assets will be like the credentials that they distribute. And then for complicated systems, I might capture a sequence or a data flow diagram to help explain how bits of it work. And that'll talk about components and assets as well. And then lastly, threats and controls, right? When you talk about those, you're often talking about, well, a particular threat affects a component and affects an asset, and you have all those linked together there. So you end up with this web of connected information in your threat model. And that is what will let you detect inconsistencies, right? To potentially parts of the system you're missing. And it's important, right? Because you can't consider threats if you have missing all the threats if you have missing parts, which is what we want to avoid. That's the overall goal I was talking about at the beginning, the assurance of scope. But it's worth reiterating, right? My point here is not to tell you to capture information in tables. That's just the simple approach I took to detecting mistakes. My point is that capturing information in multiple locations, that's going to be key to detecting the mistakes people make. So value, right? Can sometimes be hard to figure out value. It's not always easy. Often a method alone is good, but it's often a long journey from knowing the way to do something and actually doing it well enough that it's valuable. So I'm going to cover some things to avoid, what tips I do for you to succeed, and also the terms of value, what sort of results I saw that made me think this approach was sort of worth the effort. First, some things to avoid, right? So if you want to do consistency and have things reference each other, you could number things and that's fine, but you don't want to end up with situations where you have tables full of just numbers, right? I think like that's going to be sacrificing your comprehension in your threat model for capturing structured information or referencing stuff. So I'd recommend avoiding that. You can't skip the reviews, right? Like it is possible to still arrange a consistent threat model that actually has an incomplete scope of what it actually should be. It's generally done by removing lots of stuff. So someone from either the security team or a security champion, they're probably going to need to review it, at least from a common sense point of view, to make sure that everything that is there that's, well, in a common sense way, everything is there that should be. Or it's not incredibly small for some reason. This really hasn't happened to me very often, maybe a couple of times, and it's pretty obvious when it does. And when the sort of method of ensuring consistency has gone wrong for me, so it's always because the scope got too big, which makes ensuring consistency much more unmanageable. It's actually a really big problem, I think, for most approaches to threat modeling. Scope is just a challenge. Now, to avoid the scope getting too large, I sort of have these tactics that I lean on a bit. So in terms of just deciding the size of it, right? I go to my saying of nothing smaller than a repo, nothing larger than a dev team. That's sort of how I try to think about how big a threat model should be. Certainly, you can call out things that are components that are out of scope, and when they're out of scope, you sort of can ignore them from then on. That's commonly used. Pre-populating threat models for different types of solutions. This just gives you a leg up with the threat model already containing some information that'll be consistent and setting a good example. So that helps people produce consistent threat models. I allow flagrant copying of existing threat models, right? Like I think copying is a good thing, as long as they're copying an approved threat model that has been through the process and been reviewed and is accurate. Tooling can help. Not all tooling will do this. I wrote some of my own to help solve some of my problems. And then, updating your threat models. You don't need to, I don't tend to do this, update threat models, on a really regular basis, really only when there are big changes that have happened to it. Now, one of my initial slides talked about wanting to convey the value of high assurance threat modeling to you. Well, these next two slides, sort of going to cover that. So the actual value I got from this was huge, right? And I judged that by the feedback, not only the feedback I got internally, but by the feedback I got externally, right? So I went through all these audits, and my threat models, passed through all of those really well. Now, admittedly, the auditors here weren't security experts, so that wasn't really the type of audit they were doing, but these were definitely people who understood documents and how to consume them, and so it passed in that sense. Internally, hey, if you've got a really consistent document, it tends to be quite accurate. Accurate documentation is gold in any company, as I'm sure you all know, so that's really useful. It was a startup company, so there was some investor due diligence that happened, and I got really positive feedback from those, right? I really enjoyed hearing that sort of feedback. So certainly, externally, I got a lot of feedback that this was working well. Now, another way to try and think about value is through this threat modeling 4-question framework, right? Which is a great way to model the threat modeling process. And it comes with this question that asks us to think about value of a threat model, which is phrased as, did we do a good job? Now, often that's used as a sort of the program question, right, for a threat modeling program, not for an individual threat model. But, can we answer this question for a particular threat model? Well, I'm going to say that I think part of a reasonable definition of good, in terms of do we do a good job, should include consistent. Certainly, you wouldn't want a threat model that's inconsistent, I think. Now, consistency is, I think, an objective property of the threat model, right? It's verifiable. Any two people should be able to go and check that a threat model is being consistent. It's not a subjective property. It's not just how you feel about it, right? So I would say if your threat model is consistent, it is objectively good in some sense. Now, the other thing it can do, consistency can also help define this definition of done for a threat model. This means that we can say a threat model is not done until it's consistent, and it's good to sort of have that check when you're reviewing a threat model, right? And this criteria sort of helps us ensure we did a good job creating our threat model. Actually, talking about objective properties, I wonder what the other objective properties of threat models really are. I can think of coverage as being one, right? Like, have we got all the threats? Have we found all the threats for the components and assets that we're talking about? And I was thinking about this, and I thought to myself, actually, coverage turns out to be quite an easy thing to do. Most tools will generate like the permutation of all possible threats from the system that you have defined inside the tool. But I was thinking it actually tends to be difficult to do well, let's just say efficiently. Every possible permutation, sort of all the threats, it's very, very noisy and can often not be helpful to the comprehension of a threat model. When I was talking about the Microsoft threat modeling tool before, right? You have Stride and you do your DFD, and then it produces all of the threats that it can find, based on Stride for what you've input. That's fine. You have complete coverage of all the Stride threats, but you also have loads and loads and loads of them, and it's can be, a bit too much sometimes. Maybe there are other objective properties of threat models that we should all be talking about. I don't know. That's something that can be discussed. So that's really the main topic that I want to talk about today. So here are the sort of the things you can go and remember from this talk, I hope. So because people make mistakes, the scope of your threat model, well, it might be missing things. Now, to get assurance nothing is missing, well, we need to be able to detect mistakes. Consistency, well, that's a property of threat models that we can use to detect mistakes. And consistency can be achieved by capturing system information, components, assets, other things, independently in different parts of your threat model. And then actively cross-referencing that information in those different parts to see if you can find any inconsistencies. Now, ideally, you find a tool that helps you spot these sorts of things. Otherwise, you can include consistency checking as an activity when reviewing threat models. What sort of value does this give us? Well, it helps ensure your scope is not missing things and hence not missing threats. It helps produce accurate and consumable threat models. That's good. It makes it easier for people to read and reproduce for their own threat models. It helps to answer the question, did we do a good job? I think this is a fairly novel application. And it helps to define a definition of done for a threat model, right, which can sometimes be a challenge when you think about it. So those are my main takeaways. In terms of references that you might want to look up in your own time, I've got a URL here for the threat modeling template. So again, it's a Google Doc. It has all those tables that I talked about, sort of showing the layout of the information that I capture, the sorts of information that I asked for in columns and things, things like that. I also have here a link to Threatware, which is a tool I wrote. Basically, it can take, takes input, this template that's linked here, and it can automate some of the consistency and coverage checking that I talked about today, and tell you where you're missing stuff. That site also has a bunch of information and documentation on sort of how I approach threat modeling. It might be interesting for other people, and then detailed documentation on actually how to populate this this threat modeling template. And all of this stuff is all open source, so hopefully it's a benefit to someone else. And that's everything that I wanted to talk about today. So we can move on to discussions, I guess.
Cool. Thank you, Dave. That's a lot, and I was making some notes as we were going through. You know, something that came to mind was in my previous role, I do remember one of my managers saying, yes, as long as the models are consistent, it gives me confidence that you guys are doing a good job. So, so it does ring some bells with even stakeholders that okay, the fact that models are consistent gives them some level of confidence and assurance that okay, I can trust that these models will be done in a certain way every time and not vary. So that's something that came to mind. I did wonder, you know how you mentioned SABSA. Now I've come across SABSA from an architectural perspective, whether you had some example templates that you've structured your model in that way, but have you leveraged SABSA beyond that in modeling approaches? That was something that I was curious to know, but also folks, feel free to pop in your questions or unmute yourself and ask if you'd like to as well. So don't feel shy. Feel free to ask questions as well. We can pick on Dave all day today. So yeah, on the SABSA front, I'm curious, have you
Yeah,
gone to use it at a different level as well in the threat modeling space?
not a lot. I think from my perspective, I learned a bit about it, tried to understand the framework. They're talking about how they structure things, and it's very detailed. There's a lot of information in there, and it's quite daunting, I think, if you sort of look at it and try to apply it straight away. But I think there's a lot of good stuff in there, and I think you learn perhaps just a different perspective on things that maybe you hadn't considered before. I certainly did. And it was beneficial just for the broadening your perspective on security architecture and different ways of doing it. And some of the sort of the ways in which they break things down, that was what I really took away from it as being like, oh, I can do things like that, can I? Well, that's going to help me in the future. So I don't really apply it directly myself,
Yeah.
but I've certainly drawn from it and try and use the bits that I thought had real value and I could apply to other things. So like I said, it's not a solution to every
Yeah.
problem, but it's a wealth of information, and I think anyone that sort of looked into it would come away with something at least.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think I do remember finding it quite useful, even from just an understanding perspective, to look at it. We do have a few questions as well. I do not have the names, so I'm going to treat all the questions as anonymous. And I'm going to say, okay, the first one we've got is Dave, could you clarify the statement, nothing smaller than a repo, nothing larger than a dev team?
Yeah, it's a rule of thumb, let's say. There are going to be circumstances when it doesn't apply, but my sort of approach is that I think threat models shouldn't be too big. They shouldn't necessarily represent too much of something. And one of the benefits I think of going not larger than a dev team is that it means that you can talk to the dev team, and everything that you decide is in scope for the threat model, they'll be responsible for. So there's no having to reach out to 10 different teams to create your threat model, right? You can create a small threat model that's scoped to a team, and then go from there. And they're nothing smaller than a repo. I mean, that's sort of like presumably there's a repo for like the system they're creating and some sort of source code control. Now that that's just not always true, right? Like often there's more than one repo, but it's basically like it's a principle, right? It's supposed to give you a guide that if something is just one repo, try and keep it at that at least. But that it varies
Yeah.
wildly there. It's more sort of a rule of thumb that I use to sort of remind myself that big threat models too much work. I can't fit in my head. They're hard to understand and comprehend. No one else can understand them. Small threat models are more manageable, more copyable. They just win the day as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah, I imagine after a point you start getting lesser value return for your time invested. So yeah, it's definitely worth considering. And this is where I also think, to some, the way we think of it, at least within our org, we think of each individual unit being the application, and then that's our individual unit of a model. Think of it as a brick, and then you then chain the models later on, but you don't go into the complexity of the application level threats when you chain it upwards. You have that notion, but then you're looking for different kinds of threat when you are considering a complex system, if that makes sense.
Sure.
So
Sure.
that's that's the kind of approach we use internally, but that is interesting to hear that from your perspective. Cool. We have another question. We have loads of questions, by the way, Dave, so you will
Sure.
be busy. How do you validate that your scope is accurate, complete, or comprehensive?
Well, I think that's basically the topic of the talk, right? Like it's if you are capturing you capture, like for me, I capture a components table. So hey, tell me everything in the system, right? You have rows for that, but that could be missing something. So then I ask about assets. Okay, what assets do you have? Where are those stored? Now that's going to reference other locations. Then I have diagrams, and then I have operations table, and then at any stage they can put in something about threats and controls, and that's going to talk about other bits of the system. And then, for me, I look at, if I've understood the question correctly, right, to make that consistent is actually quite difficult if you're not like focusing on it. So people very often will reference something, and then they won't have mentioned it anywhere else in the threat model. And that's, you pick up that, and then at some stage you follow all those ends until you've captured everything. And at that stage, it's you have some assurance, I feel, at the end of the day, that it'd be very difficult to have described quite a lot of information and make it consistent and to have missed something out at the same time. So that is sort of what I think is one of the benefits of what I've talked about. I hope that answers the question. I may have misunderstood it.
Yeah, if whoever's asked the question wants to validate that, feel free to come off your mic and just let us know if we've not got it, if we've not got the angle of your question correct. Feel free to let us know. In the meantime, I will jump on to the next one, which is, are engineers missing things from scope a big problem in your experience?
I mean, I wouldn't say it's a huge problem. I'd say I'm constantly surprised by what doing consistency really brings to a threat model, and it's always a good feeling when you're doing this process and going through this consistency exercise, and working with the dev teams. And then you sort of highlight, oh, look, you've talked about this thing, but you haven't included it in scope. Oh, why is that? And it's like, oh, I didn't think that was going to be relevant, or I didn't realize that was important. And it turns out that they're very often surprised by other parts of the system in your company that they really rely on for their security, that they didn't really think about at the end of the day. And so it's very useful in that sense. It really opens people's minds to things that they didn't appreciate were actually quite important to the security of the thing that they are making. I think anyone who focused on doing consistency, I would guess that if you went through your threat modeling process, you probably would find things that otherwise you might have missed if you hadn't sort of made it an active thing that you tried. So I wouldn't say that people miss big things that they make, but they miss the little things, and sometimes it's the little things that can be really important for security.
Yeah, yeah. No, absolutely agree. There is a more experience in your preference-related query here on any threat modeling automation tools that you've adopted or work well in this context, or have you purely relied on tables and spreadsheets or custom-created tools?
I think initially I went through and tried to do it by hand, and that's like, as I said, if your threat model gets too big, that's quite bad. And even today, when I do a threat model, I sort of go through and mentally be like, oh, I think this is right, and then I'll run it through a tool I have, and it'll be like, oh, I missed stuff. How'd I do that? It's like it's really can be like difficult to do without a tool. So I would say I don't know of what all the tools out there. There seems to be more and more every day for threat modeling, whether or not they have something like this or how they solve the problem. So I'm not really qualified to speak about that. I would say that I mainly rely on the tooling that I have. But I would say that if your threat modeling tool that you use doesn't help people detect mistakes, that's something that I think is worth sort of talking to these vendors about, because I think it's going to be important. And it'll make your life easier and it'll produce better threat models.
Yep, great. Do you suggest capturing data in multiple places? Isn't that going to be more work for engineers?
Yeah, it's in the end, not really, because the info that I ask for is usually quite self-contained. So, when I ask for like, oh, give me a list of everything in your system that you want to threat model, asking that information, that seems like a very reasonable thing to ask. I captured that information about assets and I ask where the asset is stored, and that's also like it's a very reasonable thing to ask. I don't think that's burdening developers with asking for more information. Really, just turns out that that's going to be some repeated information in two different places, and you can use that for consistency checking. And same with threats and controls, right? It's pretty hard to talk about threats and controls without talking about components and assets. Again, you create this link, and so it's not really more, because the context in which you're asking it is normally a very sensible one. So it doesn't people don't feel like they're repeating information. Let's put it that way.
Yeah.
So I think it's fine, normally okay.
Yep. And I think this one might be a good time to launch the poll, Shinning, before I ask this question. So for the folks on the call, we just want to get another sort of round of insight from those who are on the call and what sort of industry you work in. Because in my experience, to some level, it does determine how much of a consistency view you need and how much rigor you need and how well some things might work or not. So it would be awesome to get your view on which sort of industries we have today on call, and whether you're audited on your threat models. Do we have some early responses, Shani?
Yes, so we'll give it 30 more seconds, so I will end the
Yeah. So in the meantime, there's quite a lot of questions. If we're not able to get through it, we might have to figure out a mechanism by which we have to respond. If it's offline, some way we can respond to those who've raised the queries. But there's a question around a comment/question on the presentation. Say thank you for the presentation. Agree on the medium-sized medical business where regulatory requirement is quite key. And if we come on to the question part, which is what approach would you recommend? Regulatory requirements can help drive a policy-directed threat modeling process integrated into the secure software development lifecycle. But what approach would you recommend for handling this in a large organization? So they're kind of contrasting the mid-size to the large, where business units are fragmented with not much regulatory oversight.
I mean, it's quite interesting to sort of, that's really a question about threat modeling program, I would say, and how to sort of scale that to the type of business that you have. I could give a shout out to the threat modeling capabilities as part of that threat modeling manifesto that was recently released. If you go and look that up, that talks quite a bit about the different things you can do. So I'm probably not the expert to give you that. I think some of the experts have got together and suggested ways to really scale out a threat modeling program to a company that size. I don't have too much experience to give on that, but I mean, my general opinion is that, like, you know, you need the top-down buy-in. In this case, if it's really splintered, you might need that buy-in from the different individual parts of the organization. So that sounds like quite a challenge. But if you can prove it that it works, maybe with one organization first and deliver how it delivers value, that's always a good thing when you want to convince someone else that it's going to deliver value as well.
Yeah. So I think this is in line with what we're seeing as well. So we've got quite a good proportion of people from finance and the manufacturing sector as well. And then you've got a reasonable spread from the IT and then healthcare and professional services. So in my experience of seeing models across different organizations, especially in the fintech sector, it can vary very much on the culture of the organization. At least for us, because I was in my previous org, we had this, proactive view, and everyone was on board. It was quite easy to implement a modeling program and get people on board. Now you come to this similar size, massive org, but you have a very different culture, and so then it's a completely different ball game altogether. I remember the slide you put at the start around the different things that you'd validate whether you need it for your threat modeling program or not. I think that's something that we found critical when we started our threat modeling here, is we had to relook at what does a threat model consist of, and say, okay, for us in this org, a threat model means we have these documents, we have a list of threats, mitigations, the diagrams captured in this format, and we don't focus on the risk part of it, but we consume it in the actual risk assessment process that happens. So you then have this view that we don't do risk assessments, but we provide advisories, but then we feed it into risk assessment. It might look very different for your organization. So your culture in your organization will play a huge role to how you build out this piece as well. Cool. There is a really good question here on in your journey in asking for information, you've probably made this a repeatable process. So have you got any tips around how to get information best from folks? And is there like a template or a structured way in which you get that?
Yeah, so
Or
that
specific details? Sorry.
yeah, that I mean, I put that link to that template. So that's the template I use, and that's what I give out to teams to populate. Of course, just give them a blank template. That's kind of hard work for them, and inevitably there's some work involved always, right? Especially the first time they do it. So you try and make that as easy as possible. So you can either pre-populate things in that template for given different use cases that can help. I wrote up extensive documentation on how to sort of populate everything, so at least no one can turn around and be like, "Oh, do you have any documentation for this?" I sort of throw the documentation at them and be like, "I've got loads. Go and look for yourself." And then tooling, right? Like some of the tooling I wrote, I make that available to the devs as well. So then when they do the process, they can use it to validate that they're doing the right thing. Normally, I would say, you sit down during sort of a kickoff and you introduce the process, you talk about what's available. Other examples are really key. Like people love to go and look at other people's threat models and be like, "Oh, their systems. I know that team. They're very similar to what I do. So I'm just going to start from that and just start editing that." And that sort of can be a little bit problematic when you find leftover stuff in there. But yeah, starting from someone else's threat model is such a cheat for teams. They love doing it, and it gets them where they need to go quicker. So I'm all about that.
Absolutely. I think that reminds me of the fact that we had this conversation last week where in our organization, we're not allowed to share threat models between teams, which is a shame because I think, there would be a lot of value if you could share and make it more transparent, at least within the org across teams. But it's the whole reason is it's classed as what's secret or top secret document. So you've got models, but there are teams that have view across different models. So it's not like no one knows what what the teams are doing, but it would be nice to share it across development teams to learn from each other as well. That really brings that home. Something that came to mind as you were talking, and I've made a note of this as we were going through the slides. One way to quickly validate your sort of coverage when it comes to components and things is to leverage existing systems. So if you've got ServiceNow as a central a source of truth, that's a really good place. Or you've got an asset repository of some format in your org, that's a good place to start from. You can also for us, we have something like also a controls assessment team, let's say, who go out and validate a lot of these components and controls so we can get information from there. So if you've got teams, departments, or repositories that you can leverage to make sure you have a good coverage on a specific application, by all means, reuse it. Do not reinvent the wheels. I think that's just a takeaway there. In the interest of time, I will have to cut on the questions. I will have to work with Shuning and see how we can get these questions answered and responded. But we do appreciate the questions. We do appreciate your time. I will have to quickly just let you know about the next session. Dave, do you want to bring up the slide just in the interest of time? I think it's the last slide in the deck, just to showcase the next meetup. Okay, your slide hasn't updated. The topic is slightly different. Don't worry. The content is the same, but this topic heading is Show Me the Money, Open, Fair, and Return ROI for Threat Modeling. And it will be, again, similar sort of timing on Feb the 22nd. We hope to see you all there. And I think if you've not got snow, keep your eyes out. Hopefully you'll get something sometime soon. If you're in Europe, yes, definitely. If you're not, I'm sorry, we will have to wait a bit more. But thank you all for attending this session. It's been a blast. Thank you, Dave, for taking us through the content. We look forward to the next talk. Thank you.
My pleasure. Thanks, everyone.
I'll see you in Thermal and Connect 4 and further questions that we couldn't get to today. Yeah, and thanks everyone for joining. Looking forward to the next meetup. And thanks again, Dave. And thank you, Robin, for this wonderful session. And thanks everyone for your participation.
Thank you.
Thank
Thank you,
you.
Shuning. Thank you, Dave. Thank you all.